Hi, in today's video we're going to talk about gasket scrapers. When you think gasket scraper, you probably envision a putty knife like this or a razor blade with a handle like this. Now, while there are people that use those for gasket scraping, this tool here is specifically designed for gasket scraping. We're going to talk about proper use of this tool and proper maintenance so that it can perform at its optimum level. Let's get into it. Let's start by talking about what a gasket scraper actually is. So it has a handle like this one, and then there's a short or a long shaft that leads out to a blade that's made out of fairly hard metal, and it can be sharpened to a very fine edge like a knife. This is an example of a gasket scraper that's been abused. If you look closely, you can see chipping along the edge. Let's take a closer look. Hopefully you can see that gouging now along there. And these are signs that this was an abused gasket scraper. Someone probably used it as a chisel, beat it up against something, or maybe even as a pry bar. This is not the way you want to use it. This is an example of what a gasket scraper edge should look like. Notice that it's straight, the bevel's shiny, and there are no nicks or gouges. As you can see, this edge is in much better condition than that edge that was damaged. It's very sharp, at least as sharp as a knife, very smooth. This allows it to get underneath the gasket material and scrape it up from the gasket surface. And the fact that it's so smooth and straight also means that as long as it's used properly, you're not likely to damage the gasket surface. If you're working with a gasket scraper that's already pretty damaged, there's a chance that you won't be able to get the gouging out very quickly using a sharpening stone or sandpaper. If that's the case, then you may want to take it to a grinder and remove all the burr material so you get down to a nice edge, and then go over to the sharpening process. I've got the grinder here set up for the bevel on this tool. Most of these tools should be about 30 to 32 degrees. So you can either set it exactly to that degree, or if you have a bevel on the tool, you can work from the bevel that's there. Let's get started with the grinding process. Now when you're doing this, you want to make sure that you keep the blade as square as possible. So I'm gonna use just by eye, I'm going to line the blade up with the table here. And I'm just going to push it in slowly and keeping it flat until it makes contact like that. And I'm just going to slide it sideways, keeping my finger along the bottom of the fence, and then checking my bevel as I go. Just like that. Before we work on putting an edge on our gasket scraper, we need to take a look at what our options are for sharpening. Right in front of me I have 3 different options. These 2 are very similar, and this one here is probably your least expensive route. This one here is an oil stone. This is a diamond hone, or maybe even called a diamond stone depending on where you look. And this here is just a flat surface with some sandpaper. Let's start by looking at the oil stone. This is a 3-sided stone setup. As you rotate this, you expose a different stone. They each have a different grit depending on how much metal you need to remove or what kind of finish you're looking for. You don't have to buy one quite this fancy. You could just go with one stone. Sometimes you can get single stones that have a different grit on each side, so you flip it over depending on which grit you want. Now the thing with a oil stone like this is that as you sharpen, you will remove material. So you need to make sure that you're using the whole stone, and also periodically you'll have to resurface this stone. And there's a procedure for that. I won't get into it into the video. You'd have to look that up if you go with a purchase like this. Okay, now let's take a look at our diamond hone. This is a diamond hone, also called a diamond stone. It has 4 sides, and each side is a different grit depending on how much metal you need to remove or what kind of edge you're trying to produce. These are fairly inexpensive, and they don't wear out quite the same that the way that the oil stone does. You can use them wet or dry. This is the one I'll be demonstrating on in this video. Now let's take a look at the sandpaper option. Sandpaper is going to be a fairly low cost option. You can buy kits like this that come with multiple grits. This one has 320, 400, 600, and 800. This 800 is about what you'd want to sharpen your edge with, but you may need to use some of these heavier grits like the 320 if your edge is in rough shape and you want to work a little faster to get it where you need it. We'll talk a little more about some of these when I get into the sharpening process, but again, inexpensive. If you just need to use this for a semester or something, one package should do you. But if you want to get a setup for kind of the rest of your career, I'd recommend going with one of the stone setups. We're ready to put an edge on this gasket scraper here. And to start off, for our first example, we're going to use this diamond hone here. The diamond hone only has as fine as a 600 grit surface on it. Now a 600 grit surface will be okay. I would prefer an 800, but a 600 will work. We're just going to have to be careful about removing the final burr to get a nice edge. Now I'm going to use this stone wet, so I'm going to pour a little bit of water on here, spread it out. You can use it wet or dry. Wetting it makes the process go a little better. And to start out, I need to find the bevel. So what I do is I come back down like this and I rock until I see that front edge touch the stone. And then it's as simple as keeping my arm moving parallel, trying my best not to change the angle of the blade as I move along the stone. It's going to take a little practice, but you'll get used to it. You may need to hold the stone still. And then I turn it over and look at how I'm progressing. It looks like I need to come back just a little more. Notice that I'm trying to use the entire stone, and I'm checking my bevel often to make sure that I have the right angle. Now, if this thing comes off the grinder and I need to remove a lot of material, I could switch grits. I'm not doing it in this case, but I could actually start with a more coarse grit to remove material faster and then move up through to finer grits. Once you've finished sharpening the bevel side of the blade, you're going to have to work on the burr that's on the opposite side. Now that burr is formed by metal getting pushed over towards the flat side of the blade. That happens every time you're sharpening. You always need to remove material from both sides. Let's take a closer look at what that burr is. You may not be able to see it here, but on the back side of this blade, if you rub your finger against the blade, you'll be able to feel that burr that's rolled around the back side. So what we want to do is we want to sand this or sharpen it, however you want to look at it, hone, and we're going to remove that burr and we're going to make that fine edge that we're looking for. If we don't take that off, again, this could actually scratch the gasket surface that we're trying to clean up, along with not doing the kind of job we want to do in general. So now let's work on removing the burr. Before I get started, I'm going to put a little more water on my diamond hone here. There we go. Spread it out a little bit. And we're going to lay the blade flat side down. We have two options for removing this burr. We can lay the blade down like this, and we can slide up and down the stone off to one side here in sweeping motions. Our other option is to turn the stone, or if we can do it the other way, that's fine, and we're going to work in a circular pattern. Again, make sure that the blade is flat on the stone. If the shaft here has any bumps to it in relationship to the blade, make sure that only the blade is on the stone and that we're not kicked up in any way. And as we do this, we're going to want to remove material until it becomes shiny up near this edge and we know that we've taken off that burr. Now we're going to start the sharpening process using sandpaper. It's not much different than using the stone that we were just using, and it's a lot cheaper option, but the sandpaper doesn't last very long. Let's take a look at what's involved. As I said before, we're going to work with 800 grit. Take a look at the paper here real quick so you can see this 800 here where it says P800, that denotes the grit that should be on the back of most any paper that you see. Now, I have a flat surface plate here. This is a very flat surface, and because I have it, this is what I choose to sharpen on. Now, you don't have to have something like this just to sharpen. You can use a countertop that's in really good condition, or the flat top of a toolbox that's in very good condition as well. You would not want to use something as nicked up and damaged as the top of this countertop here. It's not in good enough condition. And I'm going to take this. Everything else is pretty much the same. If you want to tape down the paper, you can. I would recommend, when you're done, that you take up any adhesive that might be on the plate. This plate is oily, so you have to wipe that off before you put down the tape. And I'd recommend using masking tape. It's going to be much easier to take off and clean up. I just hold it down like this. I don't have any problem with that, and I work with one hand. So setting up the bevel is the same. I just rock until I see the edge hit the paper, and then I slide back and forth. And I want to overlap my strokes as much as possible. This isn't as important on this flat plate, but if you did this on a countertop or a toolbox, it would be extremely important. The more we overlap, the better the chance that we're going to get the edge nice and straight. Now, remember that the burr forms on the other side of the blade. So we'll take this paper, I'll put a fresh edge over here, and I'm going to just take off that burr, and we'll feel that edge, and that feels really good. If you have to, you can go back and try to work that burr the other way again, and then take it off again. And that's all there is to it. Earlier when we were working on the diamond hone, I said that 600 grit wasn't quite fine enough for what we wanted to do. It's close, and you could probably get by with it, but we want to go a little finer. So what I have here is 2500 grit sandpaper. Comes out of a kit like this. You can buy it by itself. This kit's pretty inexpensive, and it comes with grits anywhere from 1000 to 2500. And what we're doing is we're going to take that burr on the end of this edge, and we're going to hone it down to a very, very fine polish with this paper. Let's take a look at what that process is. Take your gasket scraper and place it fairly flat down the paper and just drag back. Doesn't take much. And then flip it over to the bevel side. Drag back again. Drag back on the flat. And just keep doing that and feeling your edge until it's honed very, very sharp. It's not necessary that we get razor sharp. Like I've said, being knife sharp is plenty. We just need a fine enough edge to be able to get underneath the gasket material, and we want it to be smooth enough that we don't ruin the gasket surface by scratching it or gouging it. And that's the nice thing about this being so flat, is that it will ride along the flat gasket surface. It shouldn't flex and gouge as long as we're working with it properly. Now that we know how to properly maintain our gasket scraper, let's talk about the proper usage of this tool. Now, as you're scraping, you're going to have to work on the angle that the gasket scraper should be at. You don't want it flat on the surface, and you don't want it to be up too far. You just want it slightly tilted up, and work in small strokes like this on difficult gasket material. And when you kind of get a long streak like that, you can try to push through it, but if it starts to fight you, kind of slow down and go back to those small strokes. Try to have the gasket scraper edge across as much material as possible to make sure that you stay as flat as possible. Don't rock the gasket scraper from side to side, or you may gouge the edges, and you don't want to do that. And that's pretty much all there is to it. Let's get a little bit of a close-up of what that angle looks like. Here's a little bit of a close-up of that angle. Something to remember when you're going across narrow surfaces is to make sure that you transition from a wide area as much as possible. So if I've got a very wide bolt hole area like that, I'll try to transition into a thinner area slowly as I go across. And then again, try to keep as much of that edge on the surface as possible to keep myself nice and flat. Hopefully that angle is working for you to see where you should be. Okay. Don't force it. There may be some imperfections. Just work with it as best you can. Doesn't take very long. And there may be some residue when you're done. That residue can be cleaned up with some sort of like a Brillo, a fine Brillo pad. and some solvent. This concludes the video on gasket scrapers. If nothing else, now at least you know what a gasket scraper is, and hopefully you learned something about how to maintain it and how to use it properly. One last tip, every time you get out your gasket scraper, you should really inspect it, and you may even want to sharpen it a little bit each time just to make sure that you have a really good edge. So I hope you learned something. I hope it was informative and that you enjoyed it. And if you have any questions, please feel free to contact me during my office hours or by email or during class. And if you need a special demonstration, a little bit of one-on-one help, let me know. Thanks for watching.